So this video is based on the macroeconomic objective of full employment, and it's looking at one specific type of unemployment, which is cyclical unemployment. So the diagram illustrates what cyclical unemployment relates to. And as we can see, that there's been a shift in aggregate demand to the left, meaning that there's been a fall in real national output. And because there's been a fall in national output and there's a fall in aggregate demand, there's less need for workers. So cyclical unemployment is unemployment that results when the overall demand for goods and services in an economy cannot support full employment. So when we tend to see this is when there's been maybe a slowdown in economic growth, or even worse, when there's actually negative economic growth. So, for example, during a recession, when there's 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, we'll see high levels of cyclical unemployment. And you could argue it's kind of like the opposite of derived demand. So derived demand is when there's demand for goods and services, and therefore there's demand for factors of production, such as labour, to produce it. But if there's less demand for goods and services, then there's less demand for the labour that's needed to produce it. And that's why cyclical unemployment is also known as demand-deficient unemployment. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to look at some contextual examples over the last 10 years, just to kind of give you an idea of when the global economy has experienced high levels of it.
Number of Americans filing claims for unemployment benefits has hit a record high for a single week as the coronavirus slams the economy. Nearly 3.3 million people now out of work. Let's bring in Yahoo Finance anchor Adam Shapiro, who joins me now on the phone. And Adam, help us contextualize this. 3.3 million, it's a big number, but what exactly does this mean for Americans and the economy as a whole?
Well, it means the economy has shut down, and that's no surprise to anybody, within the continental United States. To put it in perspective, the last time the number was a record high was in the 1980s, and that was in around 650,000, 1982. So we get this 3.28 million filings for initial claims for unemployment. The expectation is next week we'll get another 1 to 3 million people filing for initial claims. And what you're witnessing is as restaurants shut down, as businesses shut down because they're not allowed to stay open, people are seeking cash. They're seeking some kind of money to get them through this crisis. So economically, we are in a recession. We won't know that for a fact until a couple quarters from now. But even the Treasury Secretary is saying that that is most likely. At least you also have the Federal Reserve Chair saying that. But they're still optimistic that the fundamentals of this economy are sound, and once we get past the coronavirus crisis, things will begin to rebound.
Adam, this number is also far higher than the Great Recession peak in 2009 of 660,000 unemployment claims. So if you can elaborate a little bit more about what does this tell us about the times we're in?
Well, nobody's ever been in a time like this.
So as the video showed, that it's worrying times at the moment for the global economy, especially within America. And even the likes of Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs have upped their estimates of the economic damage that the coronavirus will have. So, for example, they've said that actually the drop in GDP is going to be close to 30%, if not greater. And that's going to be a greater recession than 2009. So you can see even greater levels of cyclical unemployment. And even the Federal Reserve President, James Bullard, predicted that the unemployment rate may hit 30% due to the shutdown to combat this pandemic and this coronavirus. Again, as the video said, there's a rout of Americans that are filing for unemployment, and within this article we can see that all of a sudden 3.3 million, a sudden rise, and that's because certain industries just cannot function. You think about the airline industry, travel's banned in terms of going to different countries, so therefore what you're going to see is no revenue. And if you've got no revenue and you're trying to keep those profit levels in the safety margin, you're going to have to make cost cuts. And unfortunately, one of the biggest costs that you can cut is the labour force. So you're going to see those redundancies. And that's the same for your general leisure activities, your cinemas, your restaurants, your bars, and etc. They're not seeing any customers because of lockdowns in certain states and in certain countries. As I mentioned before, it hasn't officially been called a recession yet because it hasn't been those 2 consecutive quarters, but we do know that in 2009 in the UK we did see that recession and we did see that rise in unemployment and cyclical unemployment. So if we have a look at, for example, around 08, 09 where it really hit the UK, we see a sudden rise in unemployment. And therefore, there was a rise in the onflow of the claimant count with more people seeking job seekers. And by the end of 2011, almost 2.7 million people in the UK were looking for work, and the quarterly unemployment rate reached 8.4%, which was the highest since 1995. So in considering cyclical unemployment, we also have to look at the consequences as well. And often with cyclical unemployment, it can cause a spiralling effect unless the government or the central bank intervene. And that's because, obviously, if there's an increase in unemployment, confidence is going to fall even further. And with a decrease in confidence, there's going to be lower consumption. So with even less consumption, and again, especially with disposable income falling, people unemployed income and not what they were when they had a job, so they can't spend as much. People have got a lack of job security because they can see that unemployment is rising within the country, and therefore businesses receive even less revenue and therefore have to make even further cuts, causing a spiraling effect of cyclical unemployment. Another consequence that I really want to delve into is something called hysteresis. Now, hysteresis is when the actual overall effects of a recession sometimes cannot be recovered, and it causes permanent damage to an economy. Now, if you can get hysteresis in different ways, but we're going to focus within the labour market. And if we think about cyclically unemployed after a recession, you could argue that often that unemployed or those unemployed can drift from the workforce for good and not actually re-enter the workforce and take themselves out of labour participation. Also, those who do re-enter the labour force, they're going to re-enter with less confidence because they haven't been working for perhaps a significant amount of time, so they're not as comfortable within a work routine. They're not as confident with doing their jobs because they haven't done it before perhaps, or they haven't done it for a very long time. Their skills may have deteriorated because, again, they haven't been utilising them. And also, they haven't developed those skills whilst they've been out of the workforce. So if they'd remained in the workforce, they would become more and more productive. But because they haven't been in the workforce, they haven't developed those skills. And the skills that they did have deteriorated. So therefore, when they do re-enter, they're going to be much less productive. Now, we can see this from this diagram. This is some research that was conducted after the 2009 Great Recession. And we can see the underlying trend rate of growth within red and how that suddenly changed when we looked at what happened after the 2009 recession. So in 2009, 2010, all of a sudden we can see that this black line falls underneath the underlying trend rate and a new underlying trend rate is created. And what that means is that because of the cyclical unemployment and other factors, it might be because investment obviously stops as well because of that lack of incentive. But whatever the reason, if it was hysteresis, if it was a lack of investment, productivity fell, and now the US were not able to produce as much as they could have before the recession. So their productive potential actually decreased. And when we look at the global picture, we can see that all these countries have experienced something similar, especially the likes of Czech Republic, Greece, Hungary, Ireland, Spain. These countries saw a massive loss of potential output. Now, another consequence we're going to look at is living standards. I'm just going to show you a quick video based on this. So as that video points out, there's been a large degree of relative poverty since the 2009 Great Recession, and that all stemmed from the cyclical unemployment. Obviously, there's other factors. We can look at the government's role in terms of austerity, but when you've got a large population of people out of work, trying to find work, then it's going to cause issues. And what they did find is that because of the cyclical unemployment that took place, the amount of wage growth that's happened since the Great Recession has been really, really weak and quite low. So even when the economy's got back on track and economic growth has started to rise with inflation, real wages haven't really met that level of inflation, so real wages have been down. And you could think about it from the point of view of how fragile the economy's been. Businesses still don't have that confidence, so therefore they're not really willing to employ as many people as maybe they did before. And also maybe because people were so desperate to get into the workplace that they've entered job roles which were less productive and the pay wasn't as high maybe as it was before.